Let the Circle Be Unbroken by Mildred D. Taylor. Chapter 3. From our perches in the trees which overlooked the courtroom, we could see TJ sitting beside Mr. Jameson. He looked even skinnier than he had been when I had last seen him 4 months ago, and he seemed nervous, biting at his lower lip and jumping visibly at the sounds around him. As the proceedings began, he glanced back at his parents, then turned stiffly to face the prosecutor, Mr. Hadley Maccabee. The first witness called was Mrs. Jim Lee Barnett. Her story was that she and her husband had gone to their second-floor living quarters above the Mercantile shortly after 6, as was their custom, had supper, and retired about 8 o'clock. They were awakened about an hour later by noises from below. With Mr. Barnett leading the way, they went downstairs to investigate and found 3 niggers standing there and the store safe open. Mr. Barnett, trying to stop the burglary, had attacked one of the niggers, but a second nigger holding an axe had hit him on the back of his head with the blunt of the axe. Once Mrs. Barnett saw her husband down, she had attacked the men herself, but was swiftly knocked out by one of them. When she came to, she found her husband still unconscious and bleeding badly from a head wound. The men were gone. At this point, she started screaming and ran outside for help. When Mr. Maccabee asked Mrs. Barnett who were the first to come to her aid, she replied that at the time she was quite dazed and couldn't remember everyone, but she did remember Mr. Courtney Jones, proprietor of the pool hall, and R.W. and Melvin Sims. Mrs. Barnett's testimony was liberally laced with tears and emotion, and it was clear that most of the court spectators greatly sympathized with her. The jury members sat with their backs to us, so we could not see their faces, but I had no doubt that they were too sympathetic, that they too were sympathetic. Even I, as much as I disliked the woman and felt no loss at all for her bigoted husband, I felt pity for her. But not for long. Once Mr. Maccabee had finished with Mrs. Barnett, Mr. Jameson, speaking loudly enough to be heard by everyone, yet evoking a calm, quiet that seemed almost a whisper, began to question her. He was very gentle, apologizing that he had to ask her to relive that night again, but that he needed to know exactly what she and her husband had done upon hearing the noises in the store. Mrs. Barnett seemed leery of Mr. Jameson at first, but recounted that night's events as she had been asked. She repeated that they got up. "Yes," said Mr. Jameson, "and went to their bedroom door." "Yes." "And through the living room." "Yes." "And to the hall and down the stairs." "Just a minute, Miss Barnett," Mr. Jameson gently interrupted. "Did you turn on the light first?" "As I recall, there's a light switch at the top of the stairs leading down to the store." Mrs. Barnett frowned and thought, trying to remember. Then she said, "No, sir, we didn't turn it on because it hadn't been working for more than a month. The one downstairs worked, but not that one. Jim Lee, bless his heart, had been intending to fix it, but never got round to it. It still ain't fixed." Mr. Jameson bowed his head slightly, as if in respect for the kind intentions of the departed, then probing just as gently asked if the light was on downstairs in the store. Again Mrs. Barnett was thoughtful. "No," she conceded as if to a friend, "the light was not on." She and Mr. Barnett always turned it off before retiring, and the thieves had not turned it on. Then, Mrs. Barnett, how did you see? Oh, we had a flashlight, she answered matter-of-factly. We always kept one by the bed, an oil lamp, too. Never could tell when the electricity might go out. I see. You had a flashlight. You didn't tell me. Mr. Jameson's tone was not one of accusation, but of feelings hurt by her neglecting to confide that bit of information to him. I'm sorry, apologized Mrs. Lee Barnett. What about your glasses, Mrs. Barnett? Did you have time to put them on? I noticed that most times when I've seen you, you have them on. How now? Yes, sir, I always wear them. Had to since I was a young girl. Nearsighted, you know. And did you wear them that night? There was silence as Mrs. Barnett pondered the question. You know, I don't believe I did. No, I didn't, 'cause the flashlight was on Jim Lee's side of the bed, and I didn't have no light. I remember reaching for my specs, trying to feel them on the nightstand with my hand, but I was so nervous, and Jim Lee was already at the door going down into the living room, and I was afraid he was going down the stairs by himself. So you didn't have your glasses on, which you say you need, and you did have a flashlight, and you started down the stairs. That's right. And did you and your husband go straight down the stairs and into the store? Yes. Or did you stop on the stairs for just a moment or two? Come to think of it, you know we did stop. That's when we saw them. Saw whom? The negress. I see. About how far would you say you were from the intruders? Could you tell us in relationship to the courtroom? Mrs. Barnett frowned again. About as far back as them middle benches there, I'd reckon. Mr. Jameson nodded. About 20 feet, then. Yes, she agreed. And just where were the intruders standing when you first saw them? Well, one of them was at the gun counter, and them other two was by the safe. You stated previously that one of the intruders struggled with Mr. Barnett, and another one hit him from behind with the axe. Now, which two men were involved in this? The ones at the safe, or did the one from the counter join in? It was them two by the safe, but I figure that other one would have joined in if he'd have gotten a chance. Just answer the question, Clara, Judge Haversack said from his bench. Wade didn't ask you about what that fellow would have done. Mrs. Barnett heaved an exasperated sigh. It was the two by the safe, Mr. Jameson repeated. Did that third person, the one by the gun counter, strike Mr. Barnett at all, or attempt to harm him physically in any way? Mrs. Barnett conceded that he had not. Now, Mrs. Barnett, when your husband went down the steps, did he still have the flashlight? He did. He used it to defend himself against them murderers. Dropped it when he fell. Light stayed on, though, so's I was able to see. Mrs. Barnett, you said that you saw 3 Negroes. I understand from Dr. Crandon that for many people with incorrect myopic vision, nearsightedness, everything is blurred from a distance of 20 feet, and that they would not be able to define any facial features. Were you able to distinguish the facial features of the intruders? Hello? Hang on. I know a nigger when I see one, she snapped. Yes, ma'am, no doubt. But could you describe these particular Negroes to us? They was black, that's all I know. But you did not see their features. No, I didn't. What about other features, such as height? Could you distinguish the height of the intruders at the distance of 20 feet? Mrs. Barnett seemed uncertain. Mrs. Barnett, I wonder if you'd take off your glasses so that we can try a little experiment. Mrs. Barnett turned towards Judge Haversack, a surgeon rebellion on her face, and Mr. Maccabee stood to object. What's this leading up to, Wade? Asked Judge Haversack. Mrs. Barnett has told us she didn't have on her glasses. I think that we all need to know just how much she could see. The judge considered. All right, he decided. Take off your glasses, please, Clara. Mrs. Barnett let out another sigh and took them off. Mr. Jameson then went down the aisle and spoke to several men seated on a bench near the center of the courtroom. The men stood and came into the aisle. R.W. and Melvin Sims were among them. Mr. Jameson asked Mrs. Barnett if she recognized any of the men. Mrs. Barnett squinted fiercely, but finally admitted she couldn't see who they were. He then asked if any of the men were the same height as the intruders. She was not to worry, he said, that the men standing were white. They were simply helping out with the court. With no hesitation, Mrs. Barnett dismissed 3 of the men as being either too tall or too short. She said the remaining 2 were the right height. They were R.W. and Melvin. And how can you be so certain about the height? Mr. Jameson asked him. 'Cause Jim Lee and them 2 he was fighting with were near to the same height. Jim Lee was 5'10". Them 2 gentlemen standing next to you looked to be near the same height as you from here, and Jim Lee and you was the same. How tall was the man behind the counter? Well, I didn't much pay attention to him. He never got close to Jim Lee. Mr. Jameson turned to Melvin and R.W. and asked them their heights. They blanched, looking uneasy. It's just to get a fix on the height of the intruders, gentlemen, Mr. Jameson assured them. Nothing personal. The Simses glared at him suspiciously, but gave their heights. 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10.5 inches. Mr. Jameson then asked that T.J. be brought down the aisle. Slowly, T.J. stood and saw that his hands, and I saw that his hands, which he kept on the table, were cuffed. His legs were free. Led by Deputy Haynes, he walked toward Mr. Jameson and stood beside R.W. and Melvin Sims. The courtroom was silent as everyone noted the difference in size. T.J. was much shorter and smaller. Mrs. Barnett, look at T.J. carefully now, Mr. Jameson directed. Having just identified men of 5'10" and a half and 5'9" as being the approximate height of the men who fought and struck your husband, can you say that T.J. was one of these men? Mrs. Barnett bit into her lip. There could be only one answer, but Mrs. Barnett said, I don't know. It was dark. Not that dark. You yourself said that throughout there was light from the flashlight that you could see. Now, was T.J. one of the men? Mrs. Barnett put on her glasses and replied crisply, I can't be certain. Mr. Jameson gazed at her with great patience. Well, maybe he wasn't. I can't be sure." "Can't you?" Mr. Jameson's voice was suddenly stern. "You just told this court that the two men who—" Mr. Maccabee jumped up and objected. He said that Mrs. Barnett had already given her answer, and that should satisfy the court. Judge Havishak agreed. He ordered R.W. and Melvin to sit down and for Deputy Haynes to bring T.J. back to the defender's table. Mr. Jameson turned again to Mrs. Barnett. Softly, he said, "Mrs. Barnett, I know you want, as does most everyone in this room, including myself, the murderer of your husband, to pay for his terrible crime. Now, with that in mind, I want you to think carefully about this next question." He paused as if trying to put the question right in his mind before saying it. But to my surprise, he asked no question right then. Instead, he walked over to the court table and opened a thin box and lifted out its contents. Walking back to Mrs. Barnett, he displayed what was in the box. 2 black stockings. "Mrs. Barnett, these, as you know, are ladies' stockings. They were found in the trash outside your door the day after your husband was murdered. Such items are, of course, usually worn in times of grief." He nodded at Mrs. Barnett, who crimsoned just a bit and ducked down her blackened legs farther inward to her chair. "Or sometimes just to give an aura of blackness. Now, ma'am, please forgive me the personal question, but outside your time of mourning is now, have you worn stockings of this coloring?" Mrs. Barnett, she said she hadn't, and to Mr. Jameson's question as to whether or not she had been in mourning at any time during the past year, and had perhaps thrown away such stockings, she again said she had not. "Now, Mrs. Barnett, please look at my hand." Mr. Jameson held up his hand for her to see, then slipped it inside one of the stockings. "What color does my hand appear to be?" Mrs. Barnett looked from Mr. Jameson's hand to his face, then back to his hand again. "Well, black." "Mrs. Barnett, since you yourself said that you saw no features of the men, but they were definitely black, do you think that it was possible that the men could have been wearing stockings? Black stockings?" A murmur rose in the courtroom. That perhaps the men who fought with your husband, who killed him, might not have been black at all, but white men wearing black stockings, so that you would think they were black. A wave of disbelief rose and crescendoed as Judge Havishak wildly pounded his gavel and threatened repercussions until all was quiet again. Then he glowered down at Mr. Jameson. "Now, Wade, you know all that supposition. You got no right to ask this question to testify to what was in the minds of her attackers." Mr. Jameson nodded. "Then, Mrs. Barnett, tell me this. Without having seen any of their features, noses, mouths, eyes, hair, only the blackness of their faces, can you swear that the men who killed your husband were Negroes? Before God Almighty, can you swear that?" Mrs. Barnett stared at Mr. Jameson. Doubt had set in. She stared at the stocking still covering Mr. Jameson's hand, then up at Mr. Jameson. She puckered her lips, wet them, and answered, "No, I can't say that I can. I surely can't." R.W. Sims and Melvin Sims followed Mrs. Barnett on the witness stand. Both testified they had seen T.J. and 2 other Negroes running from the back of the Barnett Mercantile when they had come into town to shoot pool at Courtney Jones's place. When asked by Mr. Maccabee why they hadn't become suspicious and stopped them, they told the court that they had recognized TJ, whom they had once befriended, and TJ had told them that he and the other Negroes had just come from Ike Foster's shed where they had been playing cards and had been accused of cheating. They claimed, according to R.W. Melvin, that they were fleeing with their winnings. R.W. laughed. At the time, I thought it was nigger business. Let them take care of it. To our surprise, Mr. Jameson did not question R.W. or Melvin, but passed over them with what he called the right to recall. Mr. Maccabee then called the white farmer who had given TJ a ride back from Strawberry in his wagon on the night of the break-in. He testified that he had picked TJ up shortly after 9 o'clock on Soldier's Road, and that TJ had told him he was coming from Strawberry. Mr. Jameson asked the farmer if he had noticed whether or not TJ had been hurt. The farmer said that TJ had been hurt, and that he had said 2 men had beaten him, but had not said who. Following the farmer, Sheriff Hank Dobbs testified that the gun Mrs. Barnett had earlier identified as having come from her store had been found by Clyde Persons, a citizen of the town deputized to apprehend the thieves. Deputy My Foot, I grumbled. Oh, Clyde Persons was one of them lynchmen. Hush, Cassie, Stacy ordered. I hushed. Clyde Persons was called and testified that he had indeed found the pearl-handled pistol in TJ's cornhusk mattress. Next, Dr. Crandon told of Jim Lee Barnett's and Mrs. Barnett's conditions when he arrived on the scene. He described Mr. Barnett's head injury, what treatment he had administered, and told them the time of death. With his testimony, the prosecution rested its case, and Mr. Jameson stood up. I'd like to call T.J. Avery to the stand, he said. All the fidgeting that had gone on during the last testimonies ceased, and all grew quiet. The faces of the boys around me were tense, anxious, waiting. I stopped breathing as TJ stood. He looked around the courtroom bewildered, as if too afraid to move. Mr. Jameson nodded to him. TJ moved mechanically to the witness stand. He was sworn in, then sat down. Mr. Jameson started his questioning of TJ by asking him to tell all that had happened that evening. TJ began with the revival meeting when R.W. Melvin had brought him up to the great faith in their pickup. TJ's words were halting and unsure, all the cockiness gone. And just how did you come to be with R.W. Melvin Sims that evening? Was that unusual? TJ looked out over the courtroom, then quickly down at the floor. Throughout most of his testimony, he kept his eyes there. No, sir. I've been with him most of the time for the last 4 or 5 months. They can give me stuff, too. Cap and tie. His last words were mumbled. Speak up, TJ, Mr. Jameson admonished kindly, so the court can hear. I said I thought they was my friends. A knot formed in my throat. Did you stay for the revival service? Mr. Jameson asked. No, sir. R.W. and Mel. TJ stopped and looked around, realizing his mistake. R.W. Melvin had told him he could address them using only their given names. But like everything else, they had said that too meant nothing. TJ lowered his eyes again. I mean, Mr. R.W. and Mr. Melvin, they said to come on, and we gone right to Strawberry, and R.W. jumped up. That's a downright lie, Judge Haversack pounded his gavel and ordered R.W. to sit down and be quiet. Suddenly R.W. looked around the courtroom, then back at the judge and sat. Mr. Jameson resumed his questioning. T.J., what was your purpose for going into Strawberry? Mr. R.W. and Mr. Melvin, they said they was going to get me that pearl-handled pistol at the Barnett store. They said they'd take me up to church like I wanted, but then we was going to go on into town and get that pistol. When you got to town, was the store open or closed? It was closed. Mr. R.W. and Mr. Melvin said there was no sense in coming back for the pistol after we'd come all the way into town just to get it. Said we'd just go in and get it, and Mr. Barnett or Miss Barnett come down. We'd just tell them we was planning on paying for it come Monday. Did you go directly into the store? No, sir. We waited about an hour first, till the lights upstairs gone out, and we figured the Barnetts was going to sleep. How did you enter the store? Through the back. There was a window there, real small, and I got through it and opened the door for Mr. Melvin and Mr. R.W. Was the window big enough for a person the size of Melvin or R.W. Sims to get through? T.J. shook his head. It was tight just for me. When you opened the door, was there anything different about the Simses? T.J. nodded. They was wearing black stockings over their heads, and they had on gloves. I got scared then, afraid they was going to do more than take the gun, and I wanted to leave, but they told me to stay. Then they broke the lock on the gun case, and they give me my pistol. And just what happened then? Mr. Jameson asked. T.J. answered, but the boys couldn't hear what he said, for coming across the courthouse lawn, fussing at the top of his voice, was Joe McAllister. "Oh, Lord, no," sighed little Willie. "We had lost all track of time." Stacy looked from Joe to T.J. and started down. "Well, better go and try and shut him up before we get into more trouble than we already in." Little Willie, Clarence, and Mo followed him down. Christopher, John, Little Man, and I stayed behind in the tree. "It's way past time to go," Joe cried. "I told y'all youngins on the way down here my Aunt Callie get after me. I ain't home before dark, and I just been a-waiting. Y'all knows I don't like being down here in the white folks' street." I was afraid that the people inside the courthouse would hear Joe's hollering, but no one seemed to notice. When the boys reached him, they turned him back toward the wagon, but Joe stopped halfway there, waving his arms angrily in the air. After a minute or so, Stacy left the group and went over to the wagon, where Wardell was haunched by one of the wheels, staring silently out at the scene. Stacy haunched beside him, then stood again, waiting. Wardell looked up at him, got up, and walked over to Joe. There were several more long moments of hefty yelling by Joe before finally he turned with Wardell and went back to the wagon. Stacy, Clarence, Little Willie, and Mo came back to the tree. "What happened?" I asked Stacy as he settled onto his branch. Joe wanted to go right now, but Wardell got him to stay. "What's happening down there?" "He did? He actually talked?" I asked, my fascination for Wardell momentarily forcing out more important matters. "Course he talked," Stacy snapped. "Now be quiet." I turned my attention back to the trial. "And you say it was R.W. Sims with a black stocking covering his face who hit Jim Lee Barnett with the axe, and that it was R.W. who shoved Mrs. Barnett, leaving her unconscious." Mr. Jameson leveled his gaze at T.J. "Is that correct?" Yes, sir." T.J. went on to explain what had occurred after both the Barnetts had been knocked out. He told of his trying to run, his threat to tell of what happened, and the Simses beating him. Mr. Jameson turned so that the spectators could see his face. His look was thoughtful, concern. TJ, you've said that R.W. and Melvin Sims told you they were going to get the pearl-handled gun for you. And you've said that you reached the store after closing, and that R.W. and Melvin Sims that you would just go in and take the gun. Mr. Jameson turned back toward TJ and lowered his voice so that it was softer, confidential, but could still be heard. Now, TJ, I want you to be very truthful, both with yourself and with the court. Did you realize you were doing wrong? TJ looked at Mr. Jameson. He bit into his lip, then looked back at his cuffed hands. Yes, sir. Then why did you do what you did? Why did you break into the store? TJ looked up, his eyes wide, as if he was sure everyone had already understood. He hesitated a moment, then said meekly, They told me to. At any time, TJ, for any moment, did you do physical harm against either Mr. Barnett or Mrs. Barnett? No, sir, I didn't. I never did. I ain't never lifted a hand against neither of them, and I wish to God I ain't never gone in there. Mr. Jameson sat down. Mr. Maccabee stood up. For an interminable time, he gazed at TJ, and TJ cowered under that gaze. Then Mr. Maccabee approached the witness stand. You done a lot of talking, boy, about the Simses and yourself, said Mr. Maccabee. About what all they done for you and about what they told you to do. In fact, you've done so much talking about it would just suspect that you didn't have much to do at all with the murder of Jim Lee Barnett, that you are simply a victim of circumstances. But what I want to know is why you have chosen to malign two hard-working young men who only did good by you. You say R.W. Melvin Sims gave you things, a cap, a tie, and this is how you repay them? By trying to put the blame on them when it was actually two of your own kind who killed Mr. Barnett? No, sir. It was, I say it's so, that you're protecting the two other niggers who took that money. Tears began to roll down TJ's face. And killed Jim Lee Barnett. Mr. Jameson stood swiftly. Your Honor. And I also say that you knew exactly what you were doing when you entered that store and that you are guilty of murder. I object, Your Honor, interceded Mr. Jameson, because whether or not you actually was the nigger who dealt the death blow, the blood on your black hands is just as red and it won't wash off. TJ was sobbing hysterically. Judge Haversack. All right, Hadley, that's enough. Judge Haversack reprimanded him without enthusiasm. But it seemed to me that Mr. Maccabee couldn't have cared less about the reprimand. He had said what he had set out to say. He continued to question TJ in a less dramatic fashion, contending that the beating TJ had incurred was indeed the result of a falling out among thieves. Black thieves. The money had never been found. Neither had the two other murderers. TJ had just been unlucky enough to be caught. And he contended that TJ, no matter what he said, was guilty of murder. When TJ was led sobbing back to his seat by Mr. Jameson, I noticed that the faces of the spectators had hardened, and I had the sinking feeling that it was all over. Reverend Gabson was then called to the stand. Mr. Jameson asked him if he had seen TJ on the night of the burglary. Reverend Gabson said that he had seen TJ at the Great Faith Revival meeting with the Sims brothers, but that none of them had stayed. All had left together. He added that most of the congregation had seen them, for they had come just before the service, which began at 7 o'clock. Mr. Jameson asked if he had overheard anything that had been said between the Simses and TJ. "Yes, sir," replied Reverend Gabson. "Mr. R.W. and Mr. Melvin said something about, 'Come on, you still want that pearl-handled pistol.' They said something about all of them going into Strawberry." "What was TJ's physical condition at that time? Had he been beaten?" "No, sir. He was fine at the church." Reverend Gabson stepped down, and Mr. Jameson called R.W. back to the stand. "Mr. Sims," said Mr. Jameson, after taking several long moments to look unhurriedly through his notes on the table. "Reverend Gabson has just testified that he and a number of people at Great Faith Church saw you and your brother Melvin with T.J. Avery on the evening of August 25th. Do you concur in this?" R.W. looked sullenly at Mr. Jameson. "We was with him, if that's what you mean. We seen him walking on the way to the church, and we give him a ride. That's what we done for him. Had pity on the nigger, and look here, see how we gets repaid. See these here filthy lies he been telling. You give a nigger an inch and he take a mile, so I guess what could we expect?" He looked past Mr. Jameson, directing the question to the people in the court. Several of the men nodded, showing they agreed. "Did you also bring him into town?" "No, we ain't done that. Him and a few of the nigger young'uns had a fallen out down at the church. So he decided not to stay, and we brought him on back toward his house, down as far as our own place, and let him off." "While you were at the church, did you or Mr. or Melvin say anything about going into Strawberry?" "We ain't." "Did you say anything about getting a pearl-handled pistol for him?" "We ain't." "I see. All those people at the church misheard you then." There was a hint of sarcasm in his tone, but Mr. Jameson gave R.W. no time to reply. "When you left the church, you said you dropped T.J. off in front of your place. Did you then go directly to town?" "No, we gone into the house first." "How long were you home?" "Oh, I don't know, about an hour, I reckon." "And then you went?" "That's right." "Directly?" "Yeah." "In your truck?" "Yeah." "You and your brother Melvin?" R.W. sighed. "Yeah, ain't I said that?" Mr. Jameson nodded and walked from R.W. talking to him as he crossed to his table. "And why did you decide to go into Strawberry at that hour? It was quite late, was it not?" "Wasn't so late. Me and Melvin just had an itch to play some pool, that's all. And Mr. Jones is usually open late on Saturdays. There ain't nothing wrong with that." "No," agreed Mr. Jameson. "Nothing wrong with that at all." He turned to face R.W. "Just what time did you get into town?" "How am I supposed to know that? Ain't got no watch. I'm a dirt farmer, not no fancy nigger lawyer." Mr. Jameson ignored the remark. "Well, perhaps I can help you out. Reverend Gabson testified the church services at Great Faith began at 7 o'clock, and that you arrived with the Avery boy just a few minutes before that, and that you left shortly after. So you would say that it was about 7 o'clock when you were at the church." R.W. stared somewhat dubiously at Mr. Jameson. "I reckon," he said. "And you said then you went home, dropping T.J. Avery off at that point. Now, about how long would that take?" R.W. shrugged. 5 minutes or so." Murmured Mr. Jameson, rubbing his chin. "Now, you stayed what you say was about an hour at home, then you went into town. How long does it take for you to make that trip into Strawberry in your pickup?" R.W. looked annoyed by the question. "About 40 minutes, 45, 50, somewheres in there." "So that would make it let me see, starting from 7 o'clock with 10 minutes to go home, an hour at home, and some 45 minutes to come into town. About 9 o'clock when you got here, is that correct? R.W. hesitated. Is that correct? Mr. Jameson's voice was sharp. Yeah, I guess so. Mr. Jameson nodded. Can you describe your truck to us? What's that got to do with anything? Just describe the truck, please. It looks about like any other around here. But if it were parked with 50 others, you'd know it. Of course I'd know it. How? R.W. fidgeted just a bit in his chair, glanced at the people watching him, and answered, It's an old Model T. Don't know the year. It's black, mostly, and kind of beat up with a right blue fender. A right blue fender? Questioned Mr. Jameson. R.W. smiled. Yeah, me and Melvin started to paint it one time, and we run out of paint. The spectators laughed. Mr. Jameson started to paint it. Mr. Jameson smiled as well. A very distinctive truck, then, he said. One most likely not to be confused with any other, wouldn't you say? The grin left R.W.'s face. Reckon not. Mr. Jameson again turned his back to R.W. and lowered his head as if deep in thought, then faced him again. What would you say if I told you that I have a man here who says he saw that distinctive truck of yours with its blue fender parked near the Barnett Mercantile on the night of August 25th, a few minutes after 8 o'clock, an hour before you said you and your brother were in town? Just what would you say to that? Talking swelled in the courtroom as people discussed this new possibility. Judge Haversack's gavel brought down silence once more. The judge looked down at R.W., who had lost all coloring, then pointed an accusing finger at Mr. Jameson. There you go with the supposition again, Wade. Now you got such a witness? There was a pause before Mr. Jameson answered. I have, he said. Some lying nigger, no doubt, accused R.W., his eyes flashing angrily. No, said Mr. Jameson calmly, then nodded to the center of the courtroom. Mr. Justice Overton. All eyes in the courtroom turned to a slight bald man, dressed in a dark suit and looking quite respectable amidst his spears. For a moment all was quiet. Then R.W. stood up, hat in hand, the color returning to his face in an angry red, and pointed accusingly at Mr. Jameson. I knows what you trying to do, Wade Jameson. I knows it, and everybody else here knows it. You're a nigger in white skin, that's what you are. Fact, you're worse than a nigger. Judge Haversack beat his gavel against the table, but R.W. paid no attention. You went against your own kind, supporting them niggers in their wagoning up to Vicksburg last spring, and here you supporting them now. All you wants is to get your niggers off. You don't care what lies you spread about decent white folks. Now, R.W., I'm not going to have this threatening, Judge Haversack. You remember where you are. I remembers all right. And I just want to say this. He turned to the jury. What kind of country is this when a white man's got to defend himself against a nigger? Huh? I just wants to know that. Well, I ain't saying no more. I done said the truth. And if a white man can't believe that over what that lying nigger said, then... Once his eyes fell upon Mr. Jameson. He just might as well be a nigger his own self. And that's the end of Chapter 3, Part 1. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.